Okay, hello everyone. Welcome to Edge Talk for April. It's the 1st of April here. It's 9:30 in the UK. I'm Ollie Benson. I'll be your chair this morning. Today we're talking about Twitter hashtags and data analytics for healthcare with Tom Lee from Symplur. I'll talk a little bit about him in a moment. So just to remind you, as usual, do join in today using both using the chat box and also using our Twitter and using our hashtag. So you can use the chat box to contribute and talk about anything that you think Tom's talking about and you'd like to react to. And we've got Janet on standby to pick up your comments and feed them back. And then if you're using Twitter, if you're on Twitter, use the hashtag EdgeTalks, and you can use our handle either School for Radicals or the Edge NHS. And Dom is there today. And also don't forget you can join our School for Health and Care Radicals and the Edge NHS Facebook groups. And they're on Facebook, just to search for them. So just to introduce the team, as I said, I'm chairing today. As I mentioned, we've got Dom, who is monitoring Twitter, and Janet, who is monitoring chat. And that's just about all that I need to do ahead of just introducing Tom. So Tom Lee is the co-founder and partner at Symplur. He's based in California in the United States. He's got nearly 4 decades of experience in the business of healthcare with special emphasis on leveraging web technologies and new program development. Considerable admin experience in data analytics in a range of healthcare settings. He's been very involved in startup organizations, including the integration of data analytics into strategic planning and reorganizing operations to maximize efficiency. He also teaches courses and has been a frequent guest lecturer for doctoral level students on a number of subjects around healthcare startup businesses. He's passionate about the evolving role that social media is playing in healthcare. And through developing Symplur, he's helping to usher in a new era of enhanced communication of valuable health information on the web. So, no further ado, it's time for me to pass over to you, Tom. Tom, are you there?
I'm here. Thank you, Ollie. Appreciate that. Let me share my screen here. I don't seem to have the option. Oh, here we go. Okay. So yes, hoping everybody can see my screen now. And good morning. My name is Tom Lee. I'm the co-founder of a healthcare social media analytics company by the name of Symplur. And it's a real privilege to be able to present here today. My hope is that by the time that we're done here, that not only are your eyes not rolling to the back of your head, but that instead I've actually inspired a whole new legion of data geeks who will embrace this stuff as much as we do at Symplur. Just to kind of maybe start out a little bit here, I wanted to give you just a brief preview of some of the things I'd like to touch on. And just kind of going over a little bit of the growth of social media over time, just kind of how that started and how that's been evolving over these last few years. And specifically, I want to spend a lot of time talking about the use of Twitter in the healthcare space. And I'm going to introduce you to the healthcare hashtag project, which some of you may be aware of, others I'm sure are not, and hopefully you'll find that to be interesting. And I want to talk about the patient voice in all of this, which is really quite a fascinating part of it for us here at Symplur. And we'll get into some data mining and take a look at some of these healthcare-related discussions, disease discussions on Twitter. And time permitting, and I think we'll be able to get to this, I'd like to take you on a behind-the-scenes tour. We'll kind of pull back the covers and show you some of the types of analytics that we're actually involved with at Symplur. And just wanted, like I say, give you that quick overview. Starting out with just a little bit of history, just to put this in perspective, and taking a quick look back in time. And we look at this kind of evolution of the web that had kind of a little bit of a slow start and not that many users early on. But over time, by the time we got up to 1998, which was when Google launched, there were about 300 million active users of the internet, and that was quite a large number of people in such a short period of time when you stop and think about that. And then there was social media, and that really kind of disrupted things. It really kind of turned everything on its head, and it started several new industries probably coming out of all that. So, now when we look at it today, about what is it now, about 16, 17 years after the launch of Google, we have over 3 billion people currently using the web. It's a tenfold increase in that time, and it's just mind-boggling when you start to think of these numbers now, the number of people that are online. And when we look at the growth of social media, that's a relative newcomer. And back in 2010, there was just under 1 billion people that were in some various social media platform at the time. And we jump forward to 2016 now, and it's in excess of 2 billion in just that short little span of time. And it's projected to be almost 2.5 billion in just a couple more years. That'll be on some social media platform. But what we find is that within healthcare, Twitter is like the 800-pound gorilla when it comes to social media. It is the channel of choice, and I don't care where, if something else is being discussed on Facebook or LinkedIn or what have you, where there's an article being shared or news breaking, if it's not already on Twitter, it will be very quickly. And that's especially true in healthcare. This seems to be the channel that the healthcare discussion has really gravitated toward. And so just to kind of get our heads wrapped around Twitter and just a few facts about it, for those of you that may not be as familiar with it. But there's an estimated roughly 300 million monthly users of the platform. And there's about 500 million pieces of information exchanged every day on Twitter, across the board of all different subjects that you can imagine. And this is a little bit old now. I would say this is probably from about 3 years ago. But at the time, there was about 1 million new accounts being signed up on Twitter each and every day. So there was this incredibly rapid rise in the number of users of the platform. And even though that's leveled off, there's still newcomers coming in every day that are joining into these conversations. It's about 50-50 male-female. You'll get figures close to that, right around that, but on average it's about 50-50 as far as the gender mix goes. And there's figures thrown around about how many, what percentage of the Twitter users have a college degree. I have 40% up here on the screen. It's probably about that, or maybe 40% have some college or a college degree or higher. And this is an interesting one. There are an estimated 500 million non-users of Twitter that read Twitter content each month, whether they're going to twitter.com and reading feeds of various sorts, or they're getting fed tweets from other mediums, other platforms, and other media out there. But they're digesting Twitter, even though they're not part of that, Twitter with their own account. And when we look at the millennials, typically, we're talking about right now people ages 15 to 34. About a third, a little bit less than a third, are active on Twitter. And of those that are active on Twitter, 81% check their Twitter accounts each and every day. And 15% will check Twitter more than 10 times a day. Very serious their Twitter usage. So why Twitter? That's the thing. What is all this attraction about Twitter? And I'll come back to that and answer that from a healthcare perspective in just a little bit. But This is a popular sentiment that you'll see oftentimes posted on the web, and this is not meant to be a knock on Facebook by any means. You know, I'm on Facebook, but what's interesting is the comment about Twitter, about where you're honest with strangers, and that does seem to be the case. And you know, perhaps it's the fact that Twitter is this completely public platform that causes us to behave a little bit more, or what have you. But it does seem to be the place where people are, in fact, open and honest with people that they perhaps have never even met. But that's not to say that Twitter does not have its problems. And for those of us who are active on the platform, let's think back when you first joined, what those first days were like. And, you know, does this sound familiar? It's kind of noisy and confusing, and I could probably come up with a list of several more adjectives. You know, intimidating even. And really understanding where to start. How do I find those parties that I want to connect with, that have similar interests to mine? And that's especially true too in healthcare. You know, when we're such a specialized industry, we have all of our different niches and things that we're interested in, different medical specialties and such. And being able to find those like-minded people that we would like to connect with and converse was a difficult thing. And, you know, try as they may, Twitter itself has seldom been the driving force behind some of the more important developments on the platform. Most often, you know, those types of things have actually come from the users. And that's actually the case with the hashtag. You know, this simple little symbol started to allow people to be able to organize on Twitter. And suddenly they could find people that are interested in the same things as them. They could meet virtually and share the same passions and you know, start to form these online communities. And healthcare totally bought into that. You know, it just seemed to be a really good fit there. Maybe it's because healthcare has just you know, got so many long words and things like that, or we're used to having abbreviations that lend themselves to hashtags anyway. But whatever the reason, healthcare jumped on board. And you know, in 2010 at Symplur, one of the things that we were really working on was looking for ways to encourage more healthcare professionals, namely doctors, to get online and start, you know, adopting social media themselves. And the reason that we were wanting to see that type of thing happen was so that we could have their expertise online helping to steer people toward good sources of healthcare information. We know that the web is flooded with information, and certainly with a lot of healthcare information. But we also know that a lot of that healthcare information is bad information. And so by getting the healthcare professionals more involved in interacting and helping to drive toward these good sources, we thought that was a worthy cause. But we knew that Twitter, you know, if we were going to get people to start joining that we were going to have to figure out a way to lower the barrier and to help them more easily connect with those people in those conversations relative to whatever their medical specialties were. And so we decided to set out and curate a list of healthcare-related hashtags. And we found just over 170 that were in wide use at the time, and we published them on our website. And we did so under the name of the Healthcare Hashtag Project. And you can visit that yourself. This is the web address, www.symplur, that's symplur.com/healthcare-hashtags. And we put this up in sort of like an interactive fashion that allowed people to click around and explore the hashtags, the conversations around them, the people that were participating in them. And in hindsight, probably one of the best things that we did was to allow others to start to submit new hashtags to us. And from there, this whole project literally just kind of took on a life of its own. If you've not been to the Healthcare Hashtag Project before, like I say, I'd encourage you to pay a visit. I think you'll be fascinated by some of the things that you'll find there. But this is what you'll find when you go to the home page. And if I can just kind of give you a real quick little walkthrough of this here. And the first thing I want to draw your attention to are these numbers where I've got that arrow up on the screen. You know, we started out with 170 healthcare-related hashtags, and we now have in excess of 9,600 individual healthcare hashtags that we're tracking and capturing information on. And when I say capturing information, every tweet that contains one of these hashtags we follow, we capture and store on our servers, and we categorize them and organize them by subject matter. And to date, we're coming up on now about 1.5 billion healthcare-related tweets in our database. It's actually the largest database of healthcare-specific tweets in the world. And that's growing now at a rate of about, on average, I'd say about 2 million tweets every day. You can explore other pages on the site. Across the top of the screen, there's a menu where you can just look at the home page here, or you could explore tweet chat related hashtags, and we have a calendar posted there of when they're all taking place, conferences, disease conversations, a whole host of different things you can do. And if you know something specific you're looking for, or maybe you don't and you just want to look for a general topic and see what the different hashtag options are, we've got this search box here. So you can type whatever you'd like in there, and it'll kind of whisk you away to what it is you're hoping to find. Every hashtag has its own page on the project site. And when you go to a hashtags page, in the upper left, you'll see the name of the hashtag. I'm sorry, did somebody ask something? Okay. Up in the upper left, we see the name of the hashtag there. And there's some brief information about it, some subject matter just explaining what it's about. And over on the right-hand side, you'll find that we show you some related hashtags, things that are parallel conversations, hashtags that are related to the same subject matter as the one on whose page you're on. And a little bit further down the page, if we scroll down, we have these top 10 lists. And we can look at, this is looking at the last 7 days of activity, but who's using the hashtag most frequently in those last 7 days, or the top 10 by the number of times they've been mentioned. And when we say mentioned, that's when people are being spoken to or perhaps spoken about. On the other side of the page, we have the most recent, maybe 15 or 20 or so tweets using the hashtag. So you get a little bit of a flavor of what some of the discussion is that's going on. And there's some other things on the page too, but I'll just go down to the very bottom. It's a very popular feature that we have there. And it gives you an opportunity to extract some information. And you can set a couple of start and end points of dates and time right down to the minute. And then you can actually pull up a complete transcript of all the tweets using the hashtag during that time parameter that you established. Or you can get some light analytics, quantitative type analytics. How many people participated in the usage of the hashtag during this time, or how many tweets were made, how many impressions, those types of things, and get a sense for how large the conversation was that way. And a lot of people do this, for example, right after a tweet chat. Maybe they weren't able to attend a tweet chat that they typically do attend. They can come here and they can get the transcript and read through it all. Or some tweet chats are incredibly busy, and it's hard to capture with your eyes everything that's going on the screen, that there's so many tweets. Well, afterwards you can go back and reread those things that perhaps you missed during the chat itself. We also allow you to look at topics. So, in this case, I've got breast cancer as a topic. And if that's what you're looking at, we'll give you a list of all the different hashtags we have in the system regarding that topic that you're interested in. And we'll identify what type of a hashtag it is. Is it a healthcare conference or a tweet chat or a true disease discussion or what have you. And when you're looking at these topic areas like this, we have a list of influencers there as well. And that's where we take all of these related hashtags and combine them together and then show you the individuals that are actually being spoken to and spoken about most frequently on this broad topic. So there's a lot you can learn about whatever the individual hashtags are that you're interested in, or find a number of additional hashtags about topics that you're interested in. And as I mentioned, you can also submit new hashtags to us for consideration for inclusion in the healthcare hashtag project. And just a couple of steps to it. It really doesn't take that long. First thing that we ask you to do is to authenticate with Twitter, just so that we know who's submitting this to us, and if we need to, contact you about any questions we have about it and what have you. But then we also have a few rules. We want to make sure that the hashtags are in fact healthcare related. That's all that we'll accept here. We want to make sure too that they have what we call a clean tweet stream, meaning that it's not a hashtag that's being used by other conversations as well. The stream should be pretty clearly healthcare related on the topic that you're suggesting that the hashtag is related to. And also, it needs to be a hashtag that's in use. A lot of times people may have a good idea for a conversation they'd like to start and have plans for starting it one day, but until there's actually some activity there, we would not accept that. So we've got certain rules that we do follow, and I'd say that on an average week, we probably get about 120 to 130 hashtag submissions, and we actually reject about 75% of them for one of those reasons that I was just mentioning. But we try to be generous in our consideration of them, and we encourage you to please submit them to us for that consideration. Since we started doing this, looking back over time, now on this chart or graph that we're looking at, it shows us the number of tweets per day at different points in time since we started this. And you can see in the very beginning, in year one, we were capturing on average about 30,000 tweets per day. And we thought that was just a massive amount of data coming in. We could hardly believe that it was at such a high level. But you can see over time, this has just grown by leaps and bounds, especially these last couple of years, to where now, like I said earlier, we're actually seeing about 2 million tweets on an average day. And sometimes that'll even skyrocket way beyond that, depending if there's some news event or something that spikes an awful lot of conversation and sharing out there. And in that same span of time, like I mentioned, we've gone from 170 hashtags to over 9,600, and our database, it has grown, like I said, all the way up to about 1.5 billion healthcare-related tweets. So any talk that you hear about Twitter's usage leveling off is just not true in healthcare. I can tell you that for sure in the healthcare space. And so with all this that we've been doing these last several years, we have lots of data, and we spend a lot of time studying it. And this morning, I thought one of the things that I could do here is show you some of the things that are contained in this data and how we're able to slice it in different fashions and some of the things that we've observed along the way. And just for starters, to kind of just put some general comments to this, over these last 5+ years now, we've seen a lot of different topics and trends kind of come and go, but there's 6 things that I'd like to just point out that kind of stand out anyway in our minds as being some of the more notable. And the first one is health information technology. Health IT was really one of the earliest, largest, and most well-organized healthcare discussions that we saw taking place on Twitter. And as a matter of fact, the hashtag Health IT was one of those first original 170 in the healthcare hashtag project. And just that one hashtag now has over 1 million tweets in our database on it alone. But it was a perfect marriage between the techie crowd that has such an interest in health information technology and the Twitter platform. And, you know, subject matter is revolving around electronic health records and mobile health technology and all these innovative, disruptive technologies that, you know, have so much potential within healthcare. And it's still a very, very active conversation taking place. The Ebola crisis, you know, this was probably the single largest healthcare discussion to take place on Twitter that we've seen. And at its peak, we were capturing over 2 million tweets on that one topic every single day. It is a massive amount of data that we have on that. It was a terrible crisis, and it was widely discussed. And it's an interesting conversation actually to dive into with all the what do I want to say, factual things that were being discussed, governments inserting themselves, trying to dispel myths and rumors and fear, you know, listening to public panic. It was a very, very active time on Twitter in the healthcare space. And I just mentioned government, and that's actually another one on our short list here, is government adoption of Twitter and hashtag usage. And, you know, watching these offices leverage this platform as a true communication channel has just been fantastic from our point of view. And this is going to sound like I'm saying this just to be nice to my host here today, but in all honesty, for years at Symplur, we have admired the NHS and its adoption and being so proactive in this space. And I would be willing to bet, I've not counted it, but I would be willing to bet that more than any other government entity around the globe, we've probably received more hashtags from various NHS offices than anywhere else. And we think it's great. And healthcare conferences, that's something that we've seen kind of evolve. It used to be that you know, all these large medical conferences around the world and people sharing the information that's coming out of them. But what happened initially was the attendees themselves would show or would submit the hashtag for the conference to us. And because it was kind of homegrown on the spot like that, sometimes we would get 2 or 3 or even 4 different hashtags for the same event. And so the conversation around those events on Twitter became a little bit fragmented. And about 3 years ago, I'd say, 2 to 3 years ago, the conference organizers just really caught on. And we now get the conference organizers submitting hashtags to us, sometimes literally like a year and a half in advance, wanting to make sure that they have corralled their, you know, the conversation around their event. And they've recognized the importance of being able to do that, and how keeping that conversation all cohesive and on one hashtag allows them then to study that conversation later on, and they can really extract insights out of that for what was resonating with the audience, what topics, what speakers, and a better plan for future events and things. And we receive now in excess of 2,000 healthcare conference hashtags every year. And Twitter journal clubs, this is like just an awesome evolution for doctors. And we see more and more of these popping up. And it's where doctors of a common medical specialty will meet on Twitter each month to discuss the latest journal articles related to whatever their area of expertise is. And oftentimes, even the authors of these articles or studies that have been published will be included in the discussion. And so, you know, there's this ability to interact with peers on the latest research, whether you're at some major teaching hospital in some urban center, or if you're in some rural outpost. And, you know, it's just been simply amazing. And the ability of doctors to be able to share this type of information and learn from one another globally directly has health implications for all of us. And then the last thing on this list is research. And, you know, this is one that we've really been waiting for. Academics stepping in and not only studying the social media space with regards to healthcare, but leveraging the social media data for other studies as well. And at Symplur, either our tools or our data have been part now of over 60 published journal articles or grant-related projects to date. And this is really a new area of science in which this free-flowing kind of unstructured data is starting to move into the spotlight. So, like I said, those were some of the more notable subjects that we've seen being discussed that I wanted to point out to you. However, there is another one that I'd like to share with you as well, because along the way, this database, as it continued to grow, we began to dive deeper and deeper into it. Some of the things we found, and one in particular, absolutely surprised us. And yes, that was the discovery of patients adopting social media. And I wish that I could, stand here or sit here as the case may be this morning and tell you that we had anticipated this, exceedingly high level of participation of patients on Twitter. But the truth is, we were completely wrong. We had no clue. We've expected to find a lot of industry insider type conversations, sort of like the virtual water cooler where people would gather and talk about issues related to their corner of healthcare or their specialty area and what have you. But also, because Twitter is, like I said earlier, it's this completely open and public platform. We just never expected that people would share such personal things as their own health issues with complete strangers. And that caught us off guard and, quite honestly, also began to fascinate us. So I'd like to share with you something. And in this short video, what you're seeing is a 22-month timeline of about 2,000 different healthcare topics that are being discussed. And each one of those conversations are visualized as a bubble. And in total, there's about 100 million tweets here. And the green bubbles symbolize the patient-centric conversations. And the pink are everything else. And the larger bubbles are conversations that have more participants and more tweets going on. They're more active. And you notice that the patient-centered conversations, the green ones, just absolutely begin to explode. And so that's what we were seeing. And we thought, well, why? Why this growth of this patient participation? What would be causing that there? My whole life in healthcare, I've had privacy, pounded into my thinking. So why would patients choose to utilize a communication platform that offered no privacy? So, next thing I'd like to show you is we can go inside of one of those green dots and learn a few things. And so in this video, this is a dynamic network centrality analysis of a rheumatoid arthritis community. And this whole thing is taking place over a single month. And the pink nodes represent individual Twitter accounts. And the larger nodes in the graph are those that are more central and influential in the community. And the green lines that you see bursting between these nodes, those are lines of communication. That's actual interaction taking place there. And the thicker lines indicate, more communication, stronger conversation going on, more back and forth between the parties. And, this is all the result of an algorithm that we run. So, basically it's all math, but it's math visualized. And what this does is it helps us to see this is a community and to see how vibrant this community is. And we start to get a sense for that there's an awful lot of things happening between the participants in this. And eventually, as we kept on contemplating this and diving in more, we began to realize that we were witnessing what we refer to as the flattening of healthcare. And let me explain. Here we're looking at a static network centrality graph of the BCSM community. It stands for Breast Cancer Social Media. And this covers about 3.5 years of data. And in a way, it kind of looks like a constellation of stars. But instead of stars, these are people that are orbiting one another. And it's the conversation, if you will, that is the gravity that holds it all together. And boundaries are being broken down. There's traditional barriers like location and profession and demographics and physical disabilities to certain extents that will not so easily stop people from joining in the conversation. And traditional hierarchies are, as a result, eroding because of these new types of communications. And communities like this one are forming. And that's what I mean when I say the flattening of healthcare. There's this disappearance of barriers and hierarchies on Twitter that really puts all the stakeholders on a much more equal level where they can simply talk to one another, and in a way that is difficult in the offline world. And if I zoom in, and you can see that there's different colored nodes in here. And in this case, the green nodes are self-disclosed patients, and the purple ones are doctors, and other colors represent various other third parties. And we've recognized that a lot of patients on social media are very engaged, and they want to do more than just simply impart their knowledge on others. We find that a number of them actually want to change the way healthcare is delivered, change the system itself. But change can really only come about, if you think about it, in a public space. And the open public nature of Twitter provides a platform like that where people can openly interact and exchange ideas with this potentially diverse set of stakeholders all at once. And in many ways, it's Twitter has become this like melting pot of ideas and people and truly disruptive innovation. It's sort of like the modern day public square for these types of things. And that's when it clicked with us what the draw was for patients to be in this space. It really opened up our eyes to why all that was happening. So where's all this going, and what's the use of all this data? Is there some useful way that it can be applied? And there really is. There really is. There's an opportunity for all kinds of things, be it academic research or business intelligence, crisis management. An interesting one there's a lot of talk about right now has to do with clinical trials recruitment. I've heard figures in the neighborhood of 60% of clinical trials fail because they are not able to recruit an adequate number of participants in the study. And yet within the social space, we can see all of these patient discussions around specific diseases taking place, and the networks that these people have built around that disease. And there just seems to be so much opportunity to better leverage this space for things like clinical trial recruitment, or even just rapid dissemination of information, understanding the virtual network and how to get, in the event of a crisis, to spread information out to the general public, and what the hubs are in these conversations to make sure that that word gets spread out. There's just really countless ways of applying this. But what I'd like to do right now is kind of jump into some disease conversations just to kind of give you an idea of some of what's happening in there. And I thought that maybe diabetes would be a great place to start with this, since it's really a worldwide issue. And this is currently, as of just a few days ago, I took a look at some numbers here. And in our system anyway, we have identified 194 diabetes-related hashtags dating back to, let's say, late 2010. And we've collected about 7.5 million tweets on the diabetes discussion to date on all these 194 various hashtags. And those tweets were made by almost roughly 1.4 million individual unique users. And when we look at the conversation over time, this is looking over nearly the last 5 years anyway, and you can see over time this was kind of ramped up steadily, especially once we got to 2015. There was just this overall enormous surge in the number of tweets on diabetes. But we've got these spikes that pop up all over. And if I can draw your attention to these 5, they're all kind of evenly spaced, and they appear to be happening at the same time each year. And that's World Diabetes Day. And we would expect to see these big spikes like that. When awareness campaigns are all taking place, and people are chiming in and wanting to draw that awareness to this chronic condition around the world. And you can see also that year after year, there's more and more and more participation going on with that event. It's a single-day, 24-hour event. But then, we've got this lone wolf spike right in the center. And I thought, what is that? Where is that coming from? And after diving into it, even then, it's hard to say that it's any one thing, because it really looks like there was a mix of things that were happening on that day. It seems like there were several different campaigns that were not necessarily related to one another, diabetes awareness campaigns. About 60% of it was in English, about 15% Spanish, about 15% Indonesian, and there were 38 different languages in all. And there was also a lot of talk about the Jonas Brothers. If you're not familiar with the Jonas Brothers, it's a boy band. And I don't remember if it was a specific brother or the band as a whole, but they won the Teen Choice Award for their diabetes advocacy that week. And collectively, the Millennials, they started really, tweeting all that up in there. And that combined with these other discussions, it just was like this perfect storm of tweets about diabetes that caused this incredible surge all in that same week. When we look at communities online, this is a community that goes by the hashtag DSMA, and it stands for Diabetes Social Media Advocacy. They've been around. I want to say they're going to celebrate 6 years this coming June or July, something like that. But it's a very interesting, tightly knit group. They meet constantly, once a week, same time each week, 1 hour discussion about, a variety of different topics, but again, all centered around diabetes. And just like we were looking at that dynamic network centrality graph or that static one, it's the same thing here with, the larger nodes are those that are more central in the conversation. You can see the arrows indicating lines of communication, and then the thickness of those lines indicating the amount of conversation that's going on. But we can also look at the community like this in a few different ways. And here, when we color code it like this, what we're doing is we're actually running what we call a community algorithm. And this is where we actually uncover some sort of like sub-networks within the larger network. So for example, the group of yellow participants, the yellow nodes in the upper left there, they tend to talk with one another more frequently than they do with the rest of the overall community. And same thing I can say for the pink or the purple or the red. And this is actually quite normal. And sometimes we find that there are smaller subjects, more specific subjects being discussed among some of these groups. And when we're looking at more global conversations, sometimes we actually find that people from shared geographic regions start to cluster together a little bit more. Even though I just got done saying a little while ago that there are no boundaries on Twitter, but this isn't so much about boundaries that keep us apart as much as boundaries, that familiarity that brings us together. But we do find these smaller groups all the time, and they're interesting to look into and to see what's happening within those smaller networks. Another thing that we do, we've been working on this for some time now, is the stakeholder segmentation. And on this one, we're color coding according to 15 different stakeholder groups that that we use to code, or I should say to categorize these participants. And on this graph, the red nodes actually are showing who the patients are, self-disclosed patients. And you can see that this is overwhelmingly a patient-driven community. It was founded by and organized and run by and attended by patients. I actually don't see any doctors in here. I see a few other healthcare professionals, and a couple that I know are dietitians or certified diabetes educators. But this is, like I say, by and large, this is a community that's organized and run by patients. And there's no doubt that the conversation that they have has really become the glue that bonds them and draws them back here every week. When we look at diabetes globally, you know, and this is a chloropath map that the darker colored areas indicate where there's higher concentrations of tweets. And again, in this case, you know, still about diabetes. And this is actually looking over a 2-year period, 2013 to 2015. And you know, it really tells us that this is a global concern. Diabetes, we can see it. It's covering all corners of the globe. And another thing that's interesting to look at is specifically when people are tweeting on these different topics out there. And when you look at this is what we call a heat map. And the days of the week are running down the left side over there. And if you look at the bottom of the graph, that's the different hours of the day, 24 hours. And then on the far right, there's that legend. And so the blue areas are where the fewest amount of tweets are happening, and the red areas are where the highest concentration of tweets are happening. And in the graph, every one of those squares is actually a 1-hour period. And in this case, we're looking at a random 2-month period in the middle of last year. And this takes the averages for the days of the week here. And so we can right away see where some hot spots are. You know, Tuesdays late morning, and this was looking at Pacific time, by the way, you know, in a few different places. But if we are interested in finding where some activity is happening and where it is that we should be planning our time if we want to participate in this, this is one of the ways that we look at it. By the same token, it's important to understand if you're an organization organizing a campaign, an awareness campaign or something like that, it's important to know when people are not tweeting. And, you know, oftentimes we find that for whatever reason, Saturdays tend to be a bit lower participation in some of these discussions than other days. Now, I'll give you an example of something that I observed a couple of years ago, and that has to do with Rare Disease Day. Rare Disease Day is, again, this is like a one-day-a-year international campaign just to raise awareness about the many rare diseases out there and the issues related to rare disease. And it's always held on the last day of February each year. But in 2015, the last day of February fell on a Saturday. And, you know, when we were looking at that World Diabetes Day on that graph a little while ago, we saw that spike. You know, every year it was going up and up and up. And it was the same thing with Rare Disease Day, except for last year when it landed on a Saturday. And they actually dropped 30% from the preceding year. This year just happened in February, just several weeks ago. Last day of February was on a Monday, and they saw about 550% growth in participation over the preceding year. Now, had they known about what Saturdays are like and lesser participation in advance, you know, perhaps they would have strategized different. But at least knowing these types of statistics out there can help with planning such events. And, you know, when we look at all these tweets about diabetes, and we look at, in this case, we're looking at last year, 2015, roughly 1/3 of all of them were retweets. And, to give you some perspective, about 48% of breast cancer tweets are retweets, about 50% of Alzheimer's tweets, and about 55% of pancreatic cancer tweets are retweets. And I can't really tell you why that is, but it does point out that there are differences in all of these different communities and in these disease areas. There's not one blanket rule of thumb, and it takes some investigation to see really how these different discussions are performing, what the norms are. And it would actually be an interesting area of study to compare, some different diseases and the style of interactions like that. Another thing is there's a lot of images that are shared, and with diabetes, all these different hashtags with diabetes last calendar year again, 22% of them had an image attached. And what's also interesting is 52% of the tweets with images were actually retweets. And that's compared to 27% of the tweets without images were retweets. And it may suggest that diabetes tweets are retweeted more often if there's an image attached. And if that's true, why would that be? And quite honestly, we are we're visual. The visual sense is so ingrained into our genetic makeup. And knowing that, images do connect with people, you can take advantage of that. And if you're really trying to spread a message, sometimes a mere link is not necessarily going to catch somebody's eye. Images do, and that's something to bear in mind. And it's always, interesting to look and see, specifically what's being said in these conversations. But when we're looking at millions, literally millions of tweets, we need to distill that in some fashion. And so one of the ways that we do this is we look at word frequency. And here we're looking at, again, this random 2-month period in the middle of last year. This is what we call a bubble graph. And the larger bubbles at the center of the graph indicate those are the words that are used most frequently in these tweets. And then it kind of spirals out counterclockwise from there. I'll zoom in so you can probably see better. But when we do this, we're looking for things that kind of stand out, things that maybe catch us off guard, and we find something like I'm seeing risk right there, and we may want to dive into that conversation and see, well, what is being discussed, relative to risk, risk factors and such there. And it's a way of starting to identify some areas of exploration. But it's also much more interesting to slice it in more detailed ways. And quite frankly, I like looking at it by different stakeholders. Is what makes it interesting for me. And when I look at the most frequently used, 10 most frequently used words by these 3 different stakeholders in tweets over that 2-month period, with patients, doctors, and advocates, the first thing that I see is that the #1 used word for each is the same. It's diabetes, and that's not a surprise. I also see that the word type is in each of those columns. But what's more interesting than what's the same is when we take a look and see what's different. Because after we start to look at the differences, we get an idea of perspective that different people bring to the conversation. And if we do this, now you can see, when I look at the patients, I see some very basic daily issues, daily concerns. And when I look at the doctors, I see, this concern for managing risk and perhaps, better understanding and treatment options. And when I look at the advocates, it's very clear, support and encouragement and urgency. But the point is, everyone, regardless of who you are in a conversation, everybody is going to bring their own background and viewpoints to the conversation. They're going to have their own perspectives. And it's important to expect that there's going to be those differences. And it's actually quite fascinating in some of these online communities where we have a real mix of stakeholders all in the conversation. I think that's really where some of the most fascinating discussions actually take place. Links, you know, there's a lot of links shared on Twitter, obviously. And when we look at diabetes again, you know, these same 2 months last year, May and June, about 73% of the diabetes tweets contained a link. That's very high. That's a lot of information that's being shared on the diabetes stream. And when we look at the most frequently shared link by doctors in the last quarter of last year, this is what they were linking to. The International Diabetes Federation's Diabetes Atlas, 7th edition. This is what the doctors were most frequently linking to. And we can look at this and see how this is played out on some other social platforms. You know, we can see that overall on Twitter, you know, not just by doctors, but you know, during that time that we see it was almost 2,400 times it was shared. But we can also see how often it was liked and shared on Facebook and shared on LinkedIn and even on Google+. But it's like I said, you know, in the beginning, Twitter is the 800-pound gorilla. You know, it's really where the healthcare conversation does tend to take place. The website that was being shared actually was offering this downloadable PDF file, which is like, I want to say it was 130 or 140 pages, something like that, and pretty much an overview of, you know, most everything of what the layperson would want to know about diabetes and the care of diabetes. And you can understand why it is that doctors would find that so important to be able to share out there. Conversely, this was the article during that same time that was most frequently shared by patients. And this is about a gentleman who is a celebrity chef who he himself has been diagnosed with diabetes. And he's kind of made it his passion in life to teach people that are living with diabetes, you know, that the road to good health is attainable, and, you know, through, you know, lifestyle changes and dietary issues and things like that. But, you know, my point is that this is a good representation of what we see over and over when we compare these two stakeholders and what's being shared, doctors versus patients. Healthcare professionals, you know, it's understandable, they tend to share links to educational material, journal articles, and, you know, things along that line. And patients tend to share links to stories about people like them, people they can relate to. And we like I say, we see that time and time again. You know, one of the things that I thought would be fun to do if we have time here, and it looks like we should have some time, is I thought we could actually go over to our analytics platform. And like I was saying early on, we can kind of pull back the covers and together kind of explore you know, one of these online disease discussions that are taking place. But perhaps before we do, are there any questions or anything coming up on the tweet stream?
I was just going to say, I think I mean, it's been totally fascinating so far, and I'm really interested in what you've been saying, and I think getting to actually sort of play with it would be great. But I know there's been some discussions on in the chat room, and I think Janet's got some questions. Janet?
Yeah, hi there, everyone. We've got several questions, actually, and I'll just start at the top. Jen wants to know, Jen and Cal wants to know, how does a Twitter journal work? That's one of the questions. Should I go through them all, or shall we take them one at a time?
I can just start with that one. I'm assuming we're referring to the journal clubs.
Yeah.
This is something that we've seen coming up over the last, well, maybe a little bit over 2 years now. I think the first one I can recall is perhaps 3 years ago. But this is where, namely, doctors decide that there'll be a certain time each month in their medical specialty. Urology, for example, was one of the early ones, that they will convene on Twitter, and they will have, before that, they will have read their medical specialty's latest journal articles, and they'll come ready to discuss their impressions and opinions or ask questions of one another about some of the most recent research that's being published in these journals. And so it's a way for them to kind of learn from one another, share ideas with their peers. And one of the fascinating things is, like I was saying, you can actually, no matter where you are in the world, all of a sudden you have access to some incredible minds in your area of specialty. And some of these journal clubs, they run for just, an hour-long period. Others, they actually convene without a designated time of day, but they plan for sharing their thoughts over perhaps 1 or 2 days freely. And it's really been interesting to watch.
Thanks, that's really helpful. There's another question from Don. How do you take a more strategic approach to your campaigns, and in particular, who to connect to get to the maximum impact?
Well, certainly, some of the things I was showing, such as just understanding what the patterns of activity are in the subject area that you're getting ready to plan a campaign for. So if we know that there's, more activity on certain days of the week than others, then, kind of center, your launch day for a campaign appropriately. Or if it's a single day event, consider when most people are participating in discussions already, what day that should be. Another is understanding the network. And, if you want to get your campaign to get some momentum, then it helps to have relationships with influential parties on that within those networks, because if they share something of yours, again, remembering that they carry a little bit more influence and are paid more attention to in some of these networks, your message is likely to get reshared time and again. And so understanding where some of those hubs are, and pre-planning and developing relationships within these specific if it's a disease area or whatever it is, but within the topic that you're going to be planning your campaign around, making sure that you've got some good connections ahead of time can be worth its weight in gold.
Fantastic. I just have one more question, and this one comes from Tony. He says, give us an example where your approach to data collection and analysis has enabled and directed change.
One of the things, and this goes back to the formation of patient communities, and I think one of the byproducts of the healthcare hashtag project was it allowed people to not only connect with one another, but to see how many other people like them there are. And I think of the rare disease community as a special one from that respect, because just by its nature, rare disease can be very isolating. You oftentimes you don't perhaps even know another person who's going through what you're going through. You may not even be able to find a medical professional who really understands. And it's, like I say, it can be very, very isolating. And so what I've seen in some of these online communities that do become, dedicated to certain rare diseases, there is this virtual support network that never used to exist. Just having that, is something that I can just see how that's been so invaluable to a number of people out there, to being able to connect and find that support, knowing you're not alone. Just that alone, can mean so much, let alone finding, things that are working for somebody who maybe, healthcare professionals in your part of the world haven't considered or what have you. So there's that learning factor as well. But I think perhaps even more than that is just the comfort factor is really been a remarkable one. And this is one that's left a big impression on me anyway.
Thank you so much. I'm learning lots from the conversation. Back to you then.
Thanks very much, Janet. I was just going to ask Tom something that I know I was thinking about. I think Sally's also brought up about sort of the confidentiality and anonymity of using something like Twitter for sort of healthcare research, because I guess you know, people are putting it out in a public space. Does that mean as a researcher you feel, you know, you can access that, or how do you sort of, you know, are there ethical considerations, I guess, around sort of this kind of research?
It's a great question. You know, and a couple of things. You know, there's certainly when we get into, like, for example, some academic institutions, they've got their rules and their ethics policies that they strictly follow. And so, you know, there's a lot of debate about that issue right now in some circles. You know, with Twitter, everything is public. That is one thing. Everything has been totally public, and it's a matter of, you know, essentially public record out there, if you will. So you know, the fact that you know, we identify who patients are on Twitter. The way that we do that, and the only way that we do that, is by identifying those people who are self-disclosing. And when I say self-disclosing, they're announcing it right in their Twitter bio. You know, when we sign up for Twitter, we fill out a short bio of who we are. And those people that identify themselves as a you know, cancer survivor or something like that right in their bio, their purpose for being on Twitter is somehow, or to some extent at least, related to that fact. And they're putting it out there for a reason. And we feel very comfortable, you know, identifying them as a patient because of that. It kind of goes back to what I was saying earlier about, you know, we find that many patients really do want to affect change. And so they'll be right up front about it and quite comfortable with it.
Right. So, I mean, we've got sort of 20 minutes left. So, I mean, I think this is the interesting go behind the scenes bit. So, if you want to continue with that, that'd be great.
Very cool. Okay. Well, let me shift over here to. So this is Symplur signals, you know, and let me just explain a little bit here. When we first started amassing all this data, you know, all of a sudden researchers started approaching us, and they wanted to not only have access to the data, but wanted to have help accessing and or finding, you know, the extracting the answers out of it. And
Tom, sorry to interrupt. We can only see your PowerPoint. I don't know if it's because you've only shared your keynote.
Okay.
So you might have to just go and share if you're using Safari.
Yeah, let me come back here.
Sorry.
No, thank you. Okay, how's that?
That looks great.
Okay, so you know, as I was saying, you know, we started to get approached by researchers, and every time they came to us, they had a new problem that they wanted to have an answer to, and this was like a you know, every time we had to develop new algorithms and tools in order to be able to extract that information. And we decided about 1.5 years, almost 2 years ago, to put a new user interface on all this and to put these tools out there for third parties to do their own research with. And the result of it all was what we call Symplur Signals. And we actually launched this at the Doctors 2.0 conference a couple of years ago in Paris. But it's a web-based platform, and it's very very report-driven, as you can see here. But I'm just going to give you an example. I'm going to look at the last 30-day period here, let's say, and just to make it easy. But I would come right in here, and this is where we would start to tell the system what it is that we want to explore. And I'm just going to use the example of breast cancer. I start typing breast cancer, and I get this topic of breast cancer that I can select from. And I'm going to pick this tweet activity report. We'll look at it by day. And what this is going to do, it's a very basic report, but it's a nice place to start, because what it does is this 30-day period that we're looking at, it gives me the activity on all the different breast cancer-related hashtags. You can see that we've probably got, I don't even know, it looks like there might be about 70 or even more than that, different breast cancer-related hashtags here. And, you know, we can see what the activity is on each one of these. You know, what I call the generic hashtag of hashtag breast cancer is the most actively used one. But down below here, you know, we see this like reoccurring spike here, this BCSM. This is actually that community that we were looking at in that one static network centrality graph that I was showing on the slides earlier, when we were trying to understand why the patients were so involved in these discussions. And maybe that's the community that we want to dive into. And so we can, you know, instead of looking at the broad subject or topic of breast cancer, we can choose instead to just look at that one community of BCSM. And if it's a community that I'm not familiar with, one of the first things that I do is I will start to look at the network analysis, and that's where we understand how these communities are structured, and who's talking to who, and who the more influential parties are, perhaps in some of these. And you know, this is what we would look at here. It's like the other graphs I was showing before. Those larger nodes are the more influential parties, those that are being spoken to and spoken about more frequently than others. And if I was to zoom in a little bit here, you can see that all of these lines are actually arrows, and they tell us the direction of the conversation, you know, who's talking to whom. And you know, the thicker lines there's more conversation taking place. And this is where it gets interesting, is when we start to segment. And in this case, you know, we're looking at these, I mentioned before, we've got these, you know, 15 different categories that we're separating parties into. We're actually 16 now. I should correct myself. We just added a new one in there. And this is where it starts to give us much more of a sense of you know, who's involved in this, and you know, what their different positions are. I like to single out certain groups, and you know, perhaps I just want to zero in and look at what's happening with the patient population, the patient discussion that's going on, you know, or maybe how the patients are interacting with doctors specifically. It's always interesting to see those types of interactions taking place in the social space. And I mentioned to you before about this community algorithm. Remember? And this is where we, you know, we identify those smaller cliques, if you will. I mean, these little sub-networks within the larger network. And we see these people that are more tightly connected, and they're talking about, you know, maybe some very, you know, specific types of things. Another thing, too, is really for any of these participants in these conversations, and I'm just going to switch back over to looking at, I just want to key in on some patients right now. But what we're able to do is click on any one of these nodes, and we get a little bit more information about the individual. And, you know, if we wanted to learn even more about them, typically in the past, what we would do is we would click on this and, you know, go to their Twitter profile and maybe look at the last, you know, 20 tweets or so, and who they're following and that type of thing. But it doesn't teach us too much about the individual. So, you know, instead, we have some other more unique ways of being able to look at it. And for example, I can choose this show tweets. And what this does is it runs a personalized transcript of everything that this individual has contributed to the discussion during, you know, this 30-day period that we're currently looking at, and on this hashtag. And by the same token, I could look and see, you know, what was being said about this person or to this person. And you know, it's just a way of being able to get, you know, much more in-depth look at them. One thing I'm going to show you today that we're actually very excited about, and this is in a way a little bit of an unveiling because this is in beta. And I don't think that I've shown this to maybe more than 10 or 15 people outside of Symplur. So, and please understand this is in beta, so we've got some rough edges that we're still working with here. But this is about 2 years in the making, this healthcare social graph. And, you know, like I mentioned, if we just go to somebody's Twitter page, we cannot learn too much about them. It's such a snapshot in time. But with all the data that we have, and dating back years, and the conversations that we've captured, and how people participate, it's allowed us to do some unique things. And in this case, and just take a moment to bring up here, but in this case, now we can look at somebody and we can understand by going back a year's time. And this bubble graph up at the top here, you can see these are, you know, different months coming across the year. So we're looking over the last 12 months. But we can see very specific conversations that this individual is influential in. And you know, the larger bubbles indicate conversations that, you know, they're more influential in. If I scroll down a bit, I can see some overall topics that this person is heavily engaged in and influential in. And you know, obviously we see breast cancer in here, just knowing that we're looking at the BCSM hashtag right now. But if I click on breast cancer, I can see what other breast cancer related discussions that she's involved with and carries influence in. So it's a way of really getting to know more about, you know, where her interests lie and where her insights and is in all these different discussions that she's involved with. On the BCSM hashtag right here, I can look at the last 52 weeks and I can see who she interacts with most often, and you know, who's talking to her or about her most frequently and who she's talking to. And right away I see Alicia right here in both columns. I probably talk together quite a bit. And anywhere that I see a Twitter handle in the system, I can just click on it and I can look at Alicia in this case in the same way and open up her healthcare social graph. And this can virtually be done with all 300 million plus profiles that we have in our system. You know, we can see what tweet chats she most often is participating in, you know, images shared and things like that. But this is, like I say, this is beta. This is something that is not open to our set of clientele yet at this point in time, but it's probably imminent, and it's for us anyway a very fascinating way of understanding the individuals and because of that much more about the conversations that they participate in. Another thing that I'd like to show you, you know, the term influencer gets thrown around so much, you know, in all these discussions, and you know, it's hard to say, you know, but influential in what way? And we have different ways of looking at that. You know, oftentimes we rely on the number of times that somebody is being mentioned, spoken to, spoken about. That's a good indication in many levels. Who's being retweeted the most, sharing the most engaging content that people, you know, want to reshare with their followers. The most active people tweeting, you know, it's not necessarily really a measure of influence. Some people just tweet more than others. Impressions gets thrown around quite a bit, and a lot of people put great weight on that. I'll tell you what, I personally discount that somewhat, and the reason is that I find that large organizations, you know, tend to have, you know, perhaps tens of thousands or even hundreds of thousands of followers, and it doesn't take but one tweet for them to make more impressions than I could make in a week, and so it kind of skews the results a little bit. I remember, I can't remember if it was an AIDS conference, perhaps, but Katy Perry, the singer, made one tweet. You know, one tweet. I think she's got, like, I forget what it is, but, you know, perhaps even 1 million followers or something. But my point is that, you know, she made more impressions on that one tweet than everybody else at the conference did. And so it skews results a little bit. Replies is interesting, only because, it takes effort. It's more than a retweet. If somebody tweets something and then it spurred somebody to actually write a message back to them, those are people that are creating conversation and instigating discussion out there. And so we can look and see who's generating the most replies. The truth is, any one of these can be gamed to some sort. It's sort of like there's lots of robots out there that you can pay to retweet you and things like that. So we've developed a proprietary algorithm that we call the Healthcare Social Graph Score. And the best way I can describe this is we take into account things like not only how many times you've been mentioned, but how influential are the people that are mentioning you? And how influential are the people that are mentioning them? And how influential are the people that are mentioning them? And it keeps on, it's like a recursive type algorithm that loops through about 1,000 times. And we also take into account things like, are they influential on the topic that you're looking at? Not just influential on healthcare or influential on cancer, but what about breast cancer or the BRCA1 or something of that nature? We'll give that much more weight in the algorithm. If it's a patient mentioning you, if it's a doctor mentioning you, if it's a known government public health account mentioning you, those carry more weight in our algorithm. And so it's highly, highly specialized for healthcare. And if we run an influencer report, in this case using that healthcare social graph, what it does, it will calculate this scoring, and we start out with this large pie graph that lets us know of this influential list of individuals, what is the stakeholder breakdown? And this big red slice here shows us it's predominantly patients. And if I scroll down, you'll see, here's this large data table that has all of these people, and they're listed in order of score. So we've got the highest score up at the top, and the highest score will be 100, and then all the other scores are relative to that. We can learn some things about them, name, their Twitter description. We talked about identifying patients, and I just looked, Alicia, who we saw in that other report we were looking at. We have her listed in the system as a patient, and right here you can see she lists herself as a 3-time cancer survivor. So that's the type of thing that we're looking for there. And we'll have other information about followers and where they're from and things like that. If I wanted to, zero in on who all these patients are, I can just kind of drill down and bring up a new list. And now we're just looking at strictly patients. And if I scroll down, here they all are. Sometimes we're looking at reports that are literally thousands of rows long, and when it's a table like this, we can actually filter for things. So I'm just going to like blogger. So I type blogger, and now just like that, I've identified a list of looks like maybe a dozen or so patient bloggers, probably on the subject of breast cancer. So it's a fast way of being able to seek out and find experts, perhaps, that you're looking for. Another thing that is oftentimes interesting is, in fact, where people are from. And, we can look at that. We saw that one world map of diabetes, and that's, that actually came from this report. And we can hover over countries and see how many individuals in each of these locations were participating in what, in this case, this 30-day period we're looking at on this hashtag. We can click on it and zoom in, and we can actually bring up a list of who these individuals are. And that list would look just like that influencers report that we were just looking at. Just kind of quickly jumping around, trying to stay conscious of time here. We looked at that word bubble report. and I can filter this actually for if I was mostly interested in what patients are saying, and I want to look at the most frequently used words just by patients on the BCSM hashtag in this last 30 days, and here it is. And I see the word guilt right here, just caught my eye, just like that. I can drill down there and be able to bring up a transcript of all of those tweets by patients where they're talking about guilt. So it's a way of being able to really uncover some of these things.
It's incredibly fascinating, Tom. As you say, just aware of the time. I know Janet's got a couple more questions, so I don't know whether if you'd be happy to answer them. Janet, over to you.
Thanks, Ollie. One of the questions that I've always battled with also, and Tony's asking that, is what do we actually mean by impressions?
We get asked that a lot, yes. So the way that we measure impressions are, it's based on the number of followers that you have. So if you make it's like a potential audience. So if you make a tweet and you have 1,000 followers, you have potentially left an impression on 1,000 tweet streams. So it's calculated by the number of followers that people have.
Thanks very much for that. And there's two other things that have come up. You've been asking in the chat room to sort of almost get together an action plan following on from the conversations and the fantastic presentation you've made. And one of them is to see whether or not Symplur would assist the school in setting up an analysis of the network. I'm not quite sure whether you'd be interested in having a conversation with us about that.
Oh, absolutely.
Oh, fantastic! I probably knew you were going to say that, Tom. But and the second thing, is that we also another action that's come out of the chat room is possibly setting up a journal club for the school or the Edge. And again, we'd like to have a conversation with you about the kind of support you might be able to offer us on that.
Sure.
Fantastic. Thank you so much.
Have to.
Really enjoyed the conversation. Thank you.
Oh, absolutely. This has been quite enjoyable. I certainly appreciate the opportunity here today.
I know it has been really interesting. I don't know if you've got any sort of final things you wanted to just sort of highlight. One question I guess I've got is the Signal stuff. Is this presumably is a paid service, or how does that work?
The Healthcare Hashtag Project is our free, open to the public service that we've had online now for just in excess of 5 years. The Symplur Signals is a subscription service that is really intended for for serious research or potentially large organizations who are trying to study marketplace and better understand how they can fit in. So that one is a paid platform.
Okay, useful to know. Cool. I mean, I don't know if you've got any sort of final things you wanted to highlight, or
really the only thing that I guess just to wrap it up is I do hope I've impressed upon people the wealth of information that is out there, and the fact that we have much to learn from it, and also that it's a very dynamic space. And a lot of people are unsure of what to do on Twitter when it comes to healthcare. And the one piece of advice that I usually would like to depart on people is just quite simply be helpful. If you have some expertise in a specific area, if you're a healthcare professional, especially, just be helpful, be available, guide people toward good information, and be supportive. And you'll reap rewards in return, I promise you.
Brilliant. Well, thank you very much. Sorry, I keep muting myself for some reason. Thank you very much, Tom. That was absolutely fascinating. I think the last 90 minutes I've learned so much about Twitter, and I've been a Twitter user since 2008, I think. So
good for you.
I feel like I'm a an established user, but I just think, I mean, the fascinating things of just seeing how, you know, when I send a tweet and put a hashtag in, actually how that can build into sort of a really detailed piece of research, and sort of, you know, actually how much information you can glean from taking me and then looking at all this, I guess, the sort of the people that I interact with, and then how, you know, how that builds to sort of such a fascinating picture. So, Tom, once again, I just want to say thank you very much. I'm sure everybody who has watched this either live or who watch the recording, and I know we get quite a lot of people who watch the recordings afterwards, will, I'm sure, be on the Symplur site checking out their hashtags, and also yeah, checking out actually sort of all the wealth of information that's on there. So thank you very much, Tom. And I guess the final thing for me to say is obviously there'll be a record of this, and we will be doing an Edge Talk this time next month, details of which will be shared shortly. So thanks very much for everybody who's joined us and taken part in our conversation and our chat, and we'll all see you again shortly.